Yeah. Why try to pretend to be? This is like the little bonus content at the beginning that Cecil can trim off. Why try to pretend to be anybody else in any endeavor, Danny? I
Yeah.
mean, you're Danny. You're Danny Kelly. That's who you are. Why would you try to pretend to be anybody else? I certainly can't pretend to be anybody else.
I'm not a
Now
very good
go back.
actor either. So just going to have to
Exactly.
like
Right. We didn't
embrace who
choose
you are.
theater. Exactly. We didn't choose theater. That's a whole different thing to analyze here on the couch. All right, let's go live. 3, 2, 1. Is it Russell Wilson's last year in Seattle? That and more this week on the couch. Danny Kelly, is it Russell Wilson's last year in Seattle?
So if I had to put odds on it, I would say it's like 60-40 potentially. Yes. I still think it's enough of a coin flip for me that I'm not going to be like, yeah, absolutely, he's done. It's over. I think there's a lot of sort of dominoes that still have to fall. The impression I kind of get though is, he's looked around the NFL. He's looked at what Tom Brady has done in terms of going to Tampa Bay, being in a system that is absolutely designed around his strengths. He's been allowed to kind of like be a part of building it. Obviously, there's a massively nice foundation there already in the defense and the receivers and everything. He's seen what Matt Stafford has done this year, forcing a trade out of Detroit, going to a team again who has a system in place, a foundation in place that the Seahawks really don't have right now, or at least doesn't feel like they do. And I think he's hyper aware of his legacy, and he wants to be known as one of the greats of all time. And if he's like languishing in Seattle when they're trying to do this like mini rebuild, maybe that's not what he wants to do long term. However, the double-edged sword there is he is aware of his legacy, and Seattle is part of his legacy, right? Like he's ingrained here. He owns, or he's a part owner of the soccer team here. I think he wants to be a owner of multiple teams. He wants to own an NFL team someday. So like the idea of him forcing his way out feels a little bit unlikely or something. I'm not quite sure how to put my finger on it, but like it just doesn't really feel like his brand, I guess. And so I think he's hyper aware of that. But yeah, it's going to be very interesting. Obviously, it feels like Pete and Russ don't really see eye to eye with kind of like what the best situation, how the best way to win is, because there's been this tension. There's been like a very palpable tension for years now about like, and part of it has been like the fans clamoring for more passing. Why are we trying to shorten the game? Why are we trying to run so much? Why are we running on early downs so much? All this stuff. But I do think it is something that Russell feels too. Like he doesn't feel like they're maximizing their potential there. And so it could come to a head this offseason. We'll see. I think a lot of stuff has to kind of still go through. Like, is Pete going to stay? Like Pete's 70. Is he going to stay long term? And if Pete is going to stay, then that's maybe where the ultimatums come down or whatever. And Russ decides to leave. So that's kind of like the gist of the situation, I think.
Yeah, and I hate doing this in some ways because there's such a compelling season going on right now, but your brain can't help but skip forward to some of the things we're going to see this offseason. And it really does seem like, Danny, that in the last few years, there's more meaningful quarterback movement in the offseason, right?
Oh, yeah.
Things are shaking loose now so that we can imagine pretty pendulum wide swings for teams depending on how they handle these things, or they stay in the hell that they're in, like the Panthers, but either way, it's meaningful and it can create a meaningful change in the trajectory of these teams. And there's a lot of different themes that intersect here. One is player empowerment, or like you said, Russell Wilson looking around the league and seeing, okay, Aaron Rodgers stayed, but Aaron Rodgers got some concessions. It looked like Russell Wilson got concessions this offseason, right? Shane Waldron, D. Eskridge, Gabe Jackson. There was some sense of, Gerald Everett coming over with, Gerald Everett. That name's going to go down in infamy now. Even though they won the game.
Rough week, yeah.
I've never seen anything like it.
I know. I was actually trying to remember that too. Have you ever seen a player? I mean, he was directly responsible for 3 turnovers in that game.
At the goal line.
Typically reserved for quarterbacks. I can't remember a skill player ever having that
at the goal line.
That rough of a game is tough.
I mean, that's the thing. Usually, if you have mistake number 2 at the goal line, you don't get a chance to make mistake number 3, right?
Right. Correct. So, and that was actually why Pete Carroll. Like, it was really surprising. All about the ball is his mantra. And after Everett had such a nightmare of a game, they go to him again to try and finish off the game. They did like a little shovel pass by the goal line and he fumbled it. So, man,
It's so funny.
it's hard.
All about the ball is perfect too, because what's in some ways the interception. Speaking of Russell Wilson, his legacy has overshadowed the good that the most lasting image from the Russell Wilson era in Seattle, because the defense really won the Super Bowl that they won, not Russell Wilson.
Right.
Anyway, so it's fascinating. There's NFL conspiracy theories about why they called Russell Wilson's number on that play instead of what was in every single person in the world's head, which was Marshawn Lynch was about to run in the game-winning touchdown, win the MVP award. Fill it in however you will. And there's another layer to this, Danny. Like, do the Seahawks have ownership right now? I mean, is there anybody who can make the call above them, Schneider and Carroll right now?
I think there was there's just uncertainty. There's no track record. No one really knows exactly how involved Jody Allen is. So Jody Allen is the sister of late Paul Allen, who, owns, he owned both the Blazers and the Seahawks, among many other of his business ventures. I would say like his sports ventures are probably like really low on the totem when it comes to like some of the important stuff that they see themselves doing and stuff with like Vulcan and all his companies. But when he died, it passed to Jody, and there's just been this uncertainty of how involved she is, if she even cares or pays attention, which I don't know if that's fair, because, maybe she does. Maybe she's very highly involved. We just don't know it. But it feels like she's got a hands-off approach. So it almost feels like Pete Carroll is like Putin or something. Like he doesn't have a boss.
Sure.
He's got all the power. He's omnipotent in Seattle. And he's got a new contract till 2025. John Schneider's till 2027, I believe, is what I've been hearing. Although I don't remember hearing that news, but that's what everyone's been saying the last couple of days. So I guess that's the case. So the front office here is entrenched, and it doesn't really feel like anyone is Pete Carroll's boss. But I would say like the situation that's gone down with the Blazers, when they removed their GM after doing like an internal investigation, it sounds like she's more involved than I think people initially maybe believe. So yeah, maybe there is this chance that she'll shake things up. I think Mike Garofalo even reported that last weekend, basically saying like she's hands-on. She's not going to just look at the last 10 years and be like, yeah, we're good. Like, let's keep it rolling. Like, there's decisions to be made. There's potential changes to be made. And so I think that is like that's exactly what I was saying with like there's more dominoes that are going to start falling here potentially before I'm ready to say Wilson's leaving for sure. If Jody Allen decides to step in and be like, hey, look, like you did great for the Seahawks for the last 10 plus years. It's just not working anymore. Like maybe that's what she'll do. And which I don't see happening, but like there's always that chance. So I think the ownership is just like this big X factor that we don't really have a good answer to because there's no track record.
Yeah. And by the way, I thought Jack Easterby was the only football figure that I would ever hear compared to Vladimir Putin. Matt Waldman's comparison for Pete Carroll is Willy Wonka, which I think is terrific.
Oh, that's so much better. That's so much better.
Yeah. But no. But Putin, the point is they're still intact. Using that comparison, just trying to understand the power structure, because that also played into Green Bay, another team that doesn't have an owner who can just step in and say, this is how it's going to be when we try to forecast these situations. But there's any number, speaking of dominoes, that can fall with a lot of these quarterback situations that bring up Jack Easterby, Deshaun Watson, all kinds of different things. And what it plays into that's been super compelling this year, of course, are these quarterbacks that are trying to fight their way into that circle of franchise quarterbacks that are trusted, like Tua Tagovailoa and Jalen Hurts. All these stories are all connected. Aaron Rodgers and Denver and so on. But let's take it back to the present. And I guess the first place I can start here with you, Danny, is I became familiar with your work and we started interacting before you ever had anything fantasy football related in your description, right?
Right.
So I guess what's your impression, especially this year? This year has been like one of those carnival rides where you just get off and you throw up and you're not really sure if you had fun or not.
Absolutely.
So how has it been acclimating to the fantasy football world? I call it the children's table. And it could be, you're doing great stuff over at the Ringer. And I'm just curious your impressions as a relatively new entry into this circle.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where you can have sort of a foundation for it. Obviously, I played fantasy football forever. But then doing it sort of casually and for fun, there's a very big difference between doing that and like having a lot of the edges that industry people have, or people that really pay close attention to it and have for years. So I think it's been a learning experience over the last few years for sure. I think I've been doing the fantasy stuff now for like 3 or 4 years. So I would say I'm much more aware of some of the edges that you can have just based on like, the analytics, the numbers, market or target share, all that kind of stuff. That's really important, like utilization. Joey McFarland does a great job of that at PFF.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff, like I think is such a huge advantage that I never knew about really before I started sort of covering fantasy football, or at least I wasn't, deep in the weeds on that. So I think it's just been a learning experience, and every year you learn a little bit more. Because I started doing Dynasty like 3 years ago, and I feel like there's a naivete when you start doing Dynasty that you just really, there's nothing that can replace it other than experience. Like, you know what I mean? Like you've done this a few years. Oh, I remember a couple of years ago, this happened, and this is how players are valued. This is some of the mistakes I made early on. I think one thing, just an example that I'm learning now, is trying to plan too far into the future can be foolhardy, and like abandoning or like selling when a guy is like 30, like a quarterback is like 36. Like nowadays, it's like you don't really need to panic and sell those guys because they play longer. Also, they're just so much more valuable to you right now. That is it really worth like selling for a future pick 2 years down the line or whatever? That's going to maybe take a couple of years to pan out in the first place. Like after you draft that guy, like are we really planning for 4 years out? Like trying to have all the planets align then? So these are some of like the lessons that you learn. I think it's just like no replacement for experience, really. I think it's kind of like the main point. It's just a lot of fun to kind of like go down this journey and really try and get better at fantasy, and also just recognize that there's a lot of luck involved, like Cordero Patterson.
Well, yeah, Cordero Patterson will be one that will always go down because for years we've all insisted he can affect football games. He can matter in the NFL. And it seemed like, except for his rookie year, and maybe Bill Belichick revived it a little bit, there wasn't a lot of will to find out if he could for whatever reason. And then enter Arthur Smith in an otherwise lost season. We have that story. And Patterson's performances the last 2 weeks have just been heroic for fantasy football because he's not 100%. He's in a terrible environment for fantasy production efficiency, and he's still finding a way. And this week, here's a transition. This week, he gets to face the Panthers. And, there's the reality show in the NFL that is so much fun, right? There's compelling layers. This year, the reality show of the NFL has just been explosive beyond any belief. Week to week, the stories like Odell Beckham or Adrian Peterson, or now it's Antonio Brown and his fake vaccination. I mean, it's just in layers upon layers upon layers. And it was funny. Sunday, you're usually getting ready to just feast Ezekiel Elliott style on games, and you see the news that Joe Brady was fired.
Random.
Joe Brady was fired, and Joseph Person, who does good work, immediately wrote up something and said, like, well, they're not really in the office right now, so it's not like they got together like, we need to make a big change. He's replacing Matt Rule is replacing Brady with Nixon, who was his guy back at Baylor. So that kind of smacks of going backwards. Wants to run the ball. Okay. Cam Newton, who it looked like everything brought back. They gave him some money. They beat Arizona. It's going to be really weird if Arizona wins the Super Bowl and the worst loss all year was put on them by Carolina and Cam Newton, because Newton was like flushing down the drain when we saw him against Miami. All of a sudden he reverted back. It was just like that game in Seattle last year, that for just a glimpse or a moment, we have this dream, like a dying dream of the great Cam Newton. And then snap, he goes back to being the declining Cam Newton. So with this emphasis on the run, is there something there with Cam Newton? Because quarterback's pretty brutal right now. There's a lot of quarterbacks that you thought was going to be your guy, and you're looking at him like Patrick Mahomes. Like, is he really my guy? Is there going to be a point when we're really weighing Cam Newton against Patrick Mahomes in the fantasy playoffs?
I know, right? There's like, are we going to start Ben Roethlisberger, who's kind of heating up over?
Well, if he's his offensive coordinator, if he's his own offensive coordinator, and then you look at matchups, that's the other thing, Danny, because now we can really understand where defenses are, not just looking at year-to-date stats, but where they're at right now. And Minnesota's defense just made Jared Goff look like Bobby Lane or something, So
Yeah, I think, and that's like sort of what I was alluding to with like the luck factor. It's all like this is the NFL in general is chaos. Like it's very hard to predict what happens in the NFL, I think. And if you have a secret for predicting what happens in the NFL, let me know. But it's one of those things where I don't know if there were signs, I guess, but like I don't know if anyone really was going to predict that like having a two coverage shell was going to like make quarterbacks look terrible across the league all of a sudden. It's like they've been playing cover 2 forever. Why is this all of a sudden a thing? But I think it's like bigger, higher level trends, player styles. Like, you know, you got Pat Mahomes and Josh Allen. These are gunslingers. They want to push the ball down the field. They want explosive plays, you know, and a lot of like the scouting reports on these guys coming out is like, oh, they're aggressive. They're going to push the envelope, maybe too much. And that was like the book on Mahomes, obviously on Josh Allen. And so now what defenses are forcing you to do is like play like this old school West Coast style offense where you're like getting the ball out on your back foot. You're taking what the defense is giving you. You're engineering 11 play drives, 12 play drives, 13 play drives. You're running the football. It's all cyclical. And I don't know if anyone was like, oh, this is what the NFL is going to be like this year. So you can wait on quarterback because none of them are going to be good, you know, because like, coming into the season, it was like, oh, you got to get this. In the old days, it was like late round quarterback, not in the old days, but like the last few years. This year it was like, well, mid round quarterback probably is actually a good investment now. But like the way that the NFL has changed is like, I think it's just, you know, every year something a little bit different. It throws you there's like a curveball there. And then when, not to go on a complete and total tangent here, but like when you were talking about the Panthers, it kind of did remind me of my early days playing Dynasty, where you got like David Tepper coming in, very sharp guy in the finance world. You have a college coach coming up to the NFL, and some of the stuff that they've done feels a little bit like a noob to Dynasty. You know what I mean? Like they decided they're going to like go their way with the quarterback thing. They're going to get rid of, well, first they traded for Bridgewater. It didn't work out. So they got rid of him. And then they passed on the quarterbacks in the draft instead and went with Sam Darnold. That didn't work out. And then after all this, like after all that cycling through, wasting a bunch of capital, blah, blah, blah. Now they're back to Cam Newton, who is the same, like, I guess the same Cam Newton probably now. And so, yeah, it to me is just like it reminded me of like my early days playing Dynasty, where like I failed to see the bigger picture or think I could come in and do something sharper than all these people that have been playing forever, and it's sort of like backfiring. And these are the hard lessons you learn early on, like starting a new sport. And in this case, they're starting in the NFL versus college, and then Tepper coming into the NFL from, you know, like the finance world or whatever. But yeah, I just think it's so funny. It's like there seems to be like that a little bit of naivete for those guys, and they're kind of learning on the job.
Yeah, the phrase that popped into my head when I saw that, Danny, was firings will continue until morale improves. You know, I just think David Tepper and Matt Rule are both just like, if I fire enough people, will that get everybody going? And some of it's luck, like you said, even for the team. But as it is in fantasy football, so it is in the NFL, and Dynasty, like you say, adds that extra time dimension where you can really have to be stuck with your bad decisions for a while.
Yeah.
And I suppose experience is the best teachers you were getting at. And it is those reactive moves that you regret the most, you know. But going back to quarterback this year and how it has been the great leveler of the playing field, like you said, making quarterbacks take what the defense gives them, and the run too. The run is back in vogue, and you're right that it's cyclical. I think that it feels chaotic from week to week, but if we pan back enough, you could understand. I think Pat Doherty threw a thought out there like that it's just the full evolution of defenses being built to stop the pass.
Yeah.
And that's how you attack those defenses. And and also the NFL is more in tune with some of these things, like passing the ball is plus EV. And then eventually you're going to use that. And that's when someone like Brandon Staley comes in and say, hey, running the ball forces teams to tackle, bad defenders tackle, take on blocks. And that's important. So you taking this all the way back to the quarterback position. Like you said, there was late round quarterback. What's up, JJ? And then what you saw was this super quarterback for fantasy football that made it so that even if you get your 20 points a week, you're still 10 points behind the Kyler Murray or the Lamar Jackson. But then in this year, there hasn't been that guy. No, I still think Kyler Murray is going to be that guy.
Yeah,
I think Kyler. I think
there's exceptions.
And Murray in Arizona, I was spending a lot of time this morning, Danny, just looking at the remaining schedule, because I really do think at this point you can triangulate like exactly what a team, like the schedule can be everything in determining a player's value from here on out.
Yeah.
And Arizona, they get to play all 4 of their games indoors. The fantasy playoffs 14-17.
Well, that's good considering last night. Yep.
Right. The Rams at home, Detroit, going to Detroit, Indy at home, and then they go to Dallas. And those are all suspect defenses too. Those are all defenses that against good offenses, pretty easy to move the ball on. I think Arizona is going to be a bonanza. You mentioned the game last night. Why is that game so strangely compelling? I find myself still thinking about it today too.
I think it's like, of course it's Belichick that is the first to officially zag against all the like light defenses and like the I don't know what the word is, homogenization of defenders. Like everybody's kind of like 6'2", 220 now on defense.
Right.
Like every player is like slowly creeping towards that size. I know that's not necessarily true, but it's like, of course he's the guy that would kind of like zag and have a lot of success with it by going heavy personnel, investing X amount of money in tight ends, because then they can, run any personnel group what they want to do. Of course, he's the guy to do that. So I think that was like part of it, like just the sort of a micro version of the macro trend. And then, of course, just flat out, like we haven't seen this in a generation or more, a quarterback throw 3 times in a game.
Right.
32 straight runs.
Mm-hmm.
Like this is like hilarious because like of everything that we've been talking about for the last 5-10 years. So I think that was why it was very compelling. Plus it was like, honestly, that was a crazy storm. Like the video from before the game and like people like in the parking lot, I'm like, how are they playing a football game in this? I think once the actual game started and like, I don't know, it just felt like way more sterile. It didn't look as crazy as I think it felt before the game, like on the actual camera. You can see the wind and sort of like when they kick and stuff, but like otherwise it looked sort of normal. It's like how you can't really see the rain when it's raining on the actual broadcast angle. So I think it was a combination of those things, like the crazy weather, the, I guess, strategy, the lore of Bill Belichick, the myth of Bill Belichick, his mythology, all coming together. And it was, of course, it was an island game, so that helps. But it definitely was fascinating.
It was. Well, and there's so many stories. I'm all about the stories, narrative street. I don't know if someone put that nickname on me or I self-applied it, but whenever I heard it, whether it was I heard it first in my own voice or someone else's voice, I owned it. But there's so many great storylines here, as you mentioned, because there's Buffalo and the curse of Buffalo, the hex of Buffalo. There's Belichick, and now Belichick's reinventing himself. Like they blew up the Death Star. That's what I said whenever Tennessee beat them in the playoffs. They blew up the Death Star, Brady, Belichick. But now there's a new Death Star. There's 2 new Death Stars. Maybe they're going to meet in the Super Bowl.
Yeah,
that's the thing too. Is that at this point with this win, New England, all the models love them, right? Like all the models are going to say New England's going to go to the Super Bowl, or at least they have the highest chance to go to the Super Bowl. And they are on track for the number 1 seed. The other matchup still to come is in Foxborough. But when you look at the game itself, Danny, everything had to break wrong for Buffalo to lose that game. Everything.
Right.
Everything. The 2-point conversion, the missed field goal, the fumble by Breida. Now, of course, they did get a gift touchdown from N'Keal Harry's face mask, but Stephon Diggs, the ball moves ever so slightly on a perfectly thrown bomb, and they're just
drops,
right. All of these different breakdowns, and that doesn't even get into the layers of I'm sorry, Bills fans, and I want to see the Bills win a Super Bowl so badly, but I just feel like in big games against good coaches, Sean McDermott gets checkmated,
gets in his own head.
Oh, yeah. And I think that's what happened against Kansas City last year. It may have happened against Baltimore. I think it's funny, the Sean's, right? Sean McVay, I think, also had that happen.
I know, right? Yeah.
Against Bill Belichick. But Belichick reinventing himself, because it was like Brady, Belichick. Oh, it was Brady. Well, what if it was both? So it was a really compelling game, even though from an offensive standpoint, it was one of the hardest games to watch.
Right.
That being said, Josh Allen really did show. How many times have we heard, it's a cold weather franchise, they need a cold weather quarterback? Josh Allen really might be the ultimate cold weather quarterback.
Oh, yeah.
He really, it was, in some ways, even though statistically his numbers don't jump off the paper, off the screen, his performance was incredible. Yeah. I think, like you said, if we could have been personally experiencing the conditions on the field at the time, that we probably would be way more impressed by what he accomplished. And basically just that he seemed mentally impervious to the conditions. He was just going to step in there and play quarterback the way he always played quarterback.
it's funny. I love this stuff because it's the like institutional knowledge, I guess that's like in the NFL and the scouting world of where you always hear guys talking about, oh, can he make it, cut it loose in the wind? Like, what do his passes look like in the wind? Do they die off at the end?
Right.
Can he like really let it loose? Does he have big hands? Like all this stuff matters because you're always all these GMs, coaches, scouts, all that like down the line. They're always thinking about these kinds of games in January, in December and January, when you're going to be playing in the wind and the rain and the snow in some cases. Like, can he cut it loose? And do we have to change the entire complexion of our offense or whatever? And so, I mean, I think regardless, you're going to have to in those conditions, but still, like, I think, like you said, it was hard to get an idea of really like what he was overcoming because again, you can't really see the wind in that context. But there was a couple passes, like that one pass down the sideline to Diggs, where he just put it right over his shoulder and they caught it. And that one like actually worked out for him. Obviously the almost touchdown earlier in the game would have been an incredible throw because he put that right where he needed to, more or less. Like obviously it moved, I think, at the end there and kind of screwed up. But I think it was like, it was very, very impressive performance from him. And I think his ability to run and kind of change the math that way, like, is also important. Like, he's not the kind of guy who I ever worry really about, like, getting hurt,
Right.
knock on wood, because he's just built like an oak. And, so he's definitely like, he's built for that. The offense in general, though, certainly is not, I would say, just because they've focused so much on the passing game. They don't really have, and this is something that Pete Carroll says all the time. And, maybe he's actually right about it. Maybe this is like thumbing his nose in the face of the nerds or whatever. But, having a run game, like he always talks about how we want to have a run game when we need it, like we don't want to have to try and make up a run game on the fly if we need to. We want to have that run game, and that takes dedication, and it takes a mindset and mentality and identity and all that stuff. And so I think that the one thing you could say about the Bills is they don't have that at all in terms of like the run game. Like the run game was pretty ineffective. And so I think that's maybe one takeaway, but I really don't know if we should overreact too much to one game because most of the time it's not even going to be like that.
Right. Well, it was that game under those conditions at that moment in each of these teams' arcs. And then I say good news. I say good news because I sympathize with the Bills fans. The Bills have 3 extremely winnable games. They basically play the NFC South. They just played New Orleans. They get Tampa this week, which is and they have the New England game left in Foxborough. But otherwise, they get Carolina and Atlanta, and they finish with the Jets. So they should get 10 wins, and 10 wins should get them into the tournament. And then let's see what they do. But like you said, that big weakness of not having the running game. And then on the flip side, too, we've seen the defense now get run over by opposing running games. Not a great combination in December and January. And it does make you wonder, circling back to Pete Carroll, Putin, Wonka hovering over this conversation, that it is about, and like Brandon Staley's comments were just so crystal clear. I love how straightforward and communicative and direct and descriptive he is. He doesn't seem like he's playing any games with the media whatsoever. And he just said it's about forcing the defenders to block and forcing them to make tackles. And that gets back to that mindset and mentality. And it makes you wonder, with Buffalo not having a running game, because with the Steelers, I grew up a Steelers fan, when Jerome Bettis would make a run and drag 3 guys, like that would get everybody fired up. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like the defense, the
defense
crowd,
too.
like,
right. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's a respect and there's a feeding off of each other kind of model there. And like you said, like we started out with Seattle. And with Seattle, it's almost like we were seeing this spat, like unstable marriage, like not quite get a divorce, but you see the problems, you see the incompatibilities. At times they make it work, at times there's a spark, and then at times you just see the differences.
Yep.
And that's another whole layer to this also, which is organizational clarity. All of these things play out with these games as we watch them.
Totally.
And that's what makes this so compelling. But like you said, it's a moving target. You mix it up and make changes one variable slightly, and the outcome becomes completely different.
Yeah, you nailed it on that one. I think like the organizational clarity, harmony, I think is so good because, and this is something I've written about going back to like 2010 when Pete Carroll and John Schneider first started, because I covered the Seahawks for a few years earlier in my career, and like the main pillars of any winning franchise, consistent winning franchise: ownership, GM / front office, and then quarterback, I think, are like the main things. Am I missing any there? Like,
right. Those are your strongest personalities.
Coach, and front office could be separate. So maybe there's 4.
Right.
But everybody has to be on the same page and in harmony, I think, in order for it to work long term. The best teams have continuity and harmony and clarity and like their thinking and their vision and what the team wants to be. I think that's why, like you said, like a marriage headed towards divorce, everyone can see it. All your friends know it's happening. Like sometimes like things are fine. But there is that, just like that underlying tension, it feels like, in the sense that like they just don't see themselves going in the same direction. Like they don't believe this is how they want to live their life or whatever,
Shared vision, right? That's what we say in a marriage. Shared vision.
Yeah.
They don't have a shared vision. I got to ask you this because you brought it up. How does having been a beat writer and having that experience, getting to be behind the closed doors, getting to learn things that you can never share with anybody, getting to write about a team and maybe try to indicate or get people to infer things, or otherwise having that access, how has it informed your ability to create fantasy football content, give people advice, analysis, jumping from those two worlds?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I actually never was a beat writer. I did blogging kind of from the outside, but I think the question remains, because I was still able sort of to like glean some stuff from people I talked to, like this is off the
sources.
Like, yeah, exactly. So I wasn't necessarily in the locker rooms, but from the point of view of like utilizing rumors or reports that you hear, or just like, the scuttlebutt from people who are plugged in, it is one of those things where I don't really honestly use it all that much, to be totally honest, because there's so much noise that I don't even know if most of the stuff is actionable most of the time. I mean, you know what I mean? Like like, for instance, like if we would have known Odell Beckham was going to get traded, then maybe like that's an actionable piece of advice. Like, invest in some of the guys on the Browns that are coming up, like DPJ, for instance, is like, that might be an interesting flyer to take because they're going to move past Odell Beckham. But like a lot of the time it's just like, there's tension here, there's this, that, or the other thing, like, and it's not super actionable because there's so much noise and there's so many different directions things could go. So I wouldn't say I really use it all that much, to be honest. Even when I have like a good scoop on something, it's like there's just always so many variables that it's not really something you can use like to your advantage or in your analysis, really.
Right. Well, there's a human element involved, because even if the fact that these things are below board, it introduces the other reasons that, or if the team is publicly saying one thing, then there's also just the stubbornness of actors like Kyle Shanahan or something like that, where there's just even, it's the whole assumption of rational coaching, right? Where I mean, look at the differing messages we got about Ezekiel Elliott's usage going into this week's game and things like that.
Yeah.
So it's potentially really high value information, but it's so low reliability, and especially when people are relying on it. Like you said, if anything, if it informs your work, it just makes you more open to the possibility if it manifests.
Yes,
but
I think that's
all you
exactly
can do.
It. Yeah,
you just put it on people's radar, but you can't necessarily act on it. And the thing is, in hindsight, Danny, the things that do happen that tilt fantasy football seasons are that wild.
Yeah.
I mean, Kyle Shanahan's going to trade up for Trey Sherman or maybe John Lynch, but I think it's Kyle Shanahan. And then by the beginning of the season, he's going to decide he likes Elijah Mitchell better. Not a little bit better either, a lot better.
Right.
And that's going to be, or Cordero Patterson's going to get used by Arthur Smith. I mean, these things, if you would have put these in front of somebody on like August 20th, they would have said, you're ridiculous. Why would I read your fantasy stuff if you're telling me stuff like this is going to happen? Right? I mean, that's just absurd.
Sure.
Nobody in their right mind actually thinks that this is going to be the year for Cordero Patterson. Finally, this is the year. Or 6th-round running back is going to beat out a running back that a guy traded up for, that he basically forced on. I mean, and that's a whole other thing too. Is like let me ask you this. Let's play the prediction game. Are we going to see Trey Lance start this year? For the rest of the year, obviously.
I would say no. I think no. Unless Garoppolo gets hurt, that would be my guess. It just feels like number one, the 49ers are pretty good. And I think that they're going to take this thing down to the wire. Like the last I checked, I haven't looked today, but like they're like top 10 in DVOA. Their offense is like top 5 in DVOA, I think.
Right.
And so I think he looks at, things from a bigger picture point of view. Like he's in it for the long run. I don't think he has any job insecurity.
No.
Like he's not on the hot seat. and he's been, I'm sure, told that a million times. So he's looking at this from like a long-term point of view. And what have we seen from Trey Lance that makes anyone think he's ready to be the starter? You know what I mean? And I think he's just going to be looking at it like, Garoppolo certainly has his flaws. Like no one, I don't think, is going to argue for that. Like that he's like an elite quarterback. But like the offense that I think Shanahan wants to run, at least right now, the way that this team is built and the way that they've been practicing and getting in the groove over the full season. Now they're like top 5 in DVOA, really good offense. I think that Garoppolo runs it fine. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And obviously the results are kind of speaking for itself. Obviously there's bad moments that happen, but I think also there's for quarterbacks that are on the hot seat like Garoppolo, where you got a rookie quarterback behind them, every little mistake just gets under the spotlight. Because you see quarterbacks make bad passes every week. Good quarterbacks make bad passes every week, and so I think there's just a little bit of that element too. I'm not a Jimmy defender. Like I think I would love to see them play Trey Lance, but I'm just like putting myself in Shanahan's shoes or whatever, and I think he's just I think he's thinking of this long term. Like Trey Lance isn't ready. He was a FCS guy who missed the entire like 2020 season, and come in here and put too much on his plate is going to be madness. And so he's in charge. He's doing it his way. He's not going to let outside influences like change that necessarily. And also they're good and like they're getting ready to get into the playoffs.
Yeah, well, they're trying to, even though they somehow lost that game. That's just a season of bizarre games. Well, it was one of the most bizarre.
This is something that we were talking about before the game this week, because on paper it made no sense that the Niners were only favored by 3. People were like, why are they only favored by 3? This makes zero sense. Like the Niners are one of the hottest teams in the NFL. Seahawks suck. Like they can't do anything. The offense is completely broken. But the thing that I always try and remember in a season is like throw out everything, like the records, anything really, when it comes to division games, because these teams know each other so well. And there's this weird sort of cyclical thing in the NFC West where if you look over the last like 10 years, the Seahawks dominate the 49ers. They've won, I think they're like 15-2 in their last 17 games. Like
it's like New England against Buffalo.
Yeah. But also, so the Seahawks dominate the 49ers. The 49ers just have Sean McVay's, like they got him, like they just know how to beat him for whatever reason. Maybe they bully ball him or whatever. So the 49ers dominate the Rams, and then the Rams dominate the Seahawks every year.
Rock, paper, scissors.
Yeah. And then apparently the Rams also, I think, there's another one that's like pretty stark over the last few years. Maybe it's the Rams over the Cardinals. I can't remember. Someone had mentioned to me, but like those were the ones that to me stood out the most. Like, it's just like, it is literally rock, paper, scissors. Every year they just beat up on each other. But none of them are dominant over everyone else, if that makes any sense. So it's just a weird division.
And it's one where maybe it's because the teams are so well defined, and it is like rock, paper, scissors, because they all have such well-defined identities, and the personnel match, again, that organizational clarity and alignment, that when you mix them up, no matter where the teams are in their trajectory compared to the rest of the NFL, they play out that way, and it becomes a matchup of the coaches. That's part of the reason I think there's so much variance, or it feels like variance. I liken it to the video game, where if you're watching a video game, you're not watching the person with the joystick, but you are kind of watching the person with the joystick, and the coaches have the joysticks, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes just you understand how to chess, right? You understand how to think further ahead than your opponent, and every time you meet that opponent, it plays out that way. No matter what pieces you have to work with, you're going to be able to outmaneuver them. And this year in particular, like you said, the rise of the cover 2, making quarterbacks. They mentioned during the broadcast last night, and this is great, right? It's so simple. Bill Belichick takes you out of your comfort zone, whatever you're comfortable doing. And again, what I love about this is the idea of make your game plan. First of all, have one-off game plans. Trust your players enough to have one-off game plans. They're professional. They're professionals. So you don't have to just stick with what we do because we've learned it, installed it for months.
Yeah.
They understand how to play football. Put something in front of them and they can learn it that week and do it. If it means you get to engage with the soft underbelly of the opponent, or otherwise stay out of the path of their knockout punch.
Right.
And you just see sometimes how coaches just have blind spots. And I guess the thing about blind spots is it's really hard to evolve past them. That's why they call them blind spots. But it makes for this really compelling path to watch. And the reason I bring this up to bring it back to fantasy, I know, and what's great is this audience is so the on the couch audience is very wonderful and forgiving. They know what's up. In all informs fantasy is San Francisco gets Atlanta, Tennessee, and Houston during the fantasy playoffs. Whoa.
Boom.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Hot knife through butter. Who's going to be the running back? I don't know. Who's going to be the quarterback? Like you said, probably Jimmy Garoppolo, unless he gets hurt, which
could happen. Or it could just
Yeah.
melt down, which I suppose is definitely possible. I'm not like ruling it out, but yeah.
And you have in the NFC, what's really interesting is we watch this chaotic season play out. You have in the NFC 5 teams that are going to make the playoffs probably, right? I mean, 5 teams for sure that'll make the playoffs, right? The Rams, Arizona, Tampa, Dallas, and Green Bay. I mean, those teams look like they're the class of the NFC. And then it's kind of a free-for-all. You know, everybody's in it for those last 2 spots. But San Francisco is one of those teams. I'm taking Minnesota off the list. San Francisco is one of those teams that if they can get into the 6 or 7 spot, they can make some noise. Because, like you said, of the way they match up against some of these other teams. And they know Arizona well. And I think that familiarity can take over in the playoffs. And again, with that, the joysticks and the engagement. The AFC, on the other hand, I was looking at the playoff schedules today, Danny. I mean, the fantasy playoff schedules.
Yep.
And just trying to project some of the teams that are in the playoff in the AFC to say, okay, how can we get a few steps ahead of this, see how it's going to turn out? Let me give you an example. Here's Baltimore's remaining schedule. Okay. At Cleveland, Green Bay, at Cincinnati, the Rams, Pittsburgh. They could go 5-0 or 0-5.
Right. That's it's a wild card.
Right. And so when you try to do any kind of domino effect of that, so we're out in the wilderness. I mean, really any number of combinations of 7 teams. I mean, Buffalo should get to 10-7 and 10-7 should get in. New England's going to be in. I mean, there are some knowns here.
Sure.
But Tennessee, who knows what they're going to look like. Right.
Yeah, they're a type of team. Both them and Baltimore, like I could see them completely falling apart. Like both have been just egregious injuries, decimation. And it's to the point where like they're kind of being held together by like paperclip and duct tape, like
they're being held together by their will, basically.
Yeah. So yeah, I could definitely see things going either way for both of those teams. I really don't know.
Yeah. And then once we get to the tournament and AFC side of the bracket, any team could run the table. Any of the 7 teams that make the playoffs could run the table, right? And why does it feel like Kansas City's going to emerge out of the rubble?
Of course,
somehow, right? But you want to believe maybe that Brandon Staley can change the Chargers' mojo. You want to believe that Joe Burrow maybe can change Cincinnati's mojo, right? Cleveland is still hanging around. They have clarity, they have alignment, they have all of those things that we say good organizations have. They just have Baker Mayfield. Speaking of 2022 storylines for a quarterback, and Odell Beckham, by the way, that storyline still has like reverberations because of, isn't it great, Danny, by the way, that social media is part of the story, right? Like the Rashard Higgins likes a post by Odell's dad. And then we have to, but that really does peel back the layer that is often at play when we see these seemingly wild swings. There is a story that if you had access to the story, you would at least understand the why, even if you couldn't see it coming, right?
Yeah.
And so it's chaotic, but at the same time, if you had perfect knowledge, it would make sense. It's just, it makes sense as much as human beings make sense, which
isn't much.
That's right. Exactly. Well, let me ask you this, just to take it back to fantasy, some good old red meat fantasy content. As you're preparing, I've had a miserable year in fantasy football. I have like 2 dynasty teams that I can get behind out of my 13. My team is you're in a league with me, and my team is I won the first 4, really the first 2 games, and I think I've won 1 out of the 20 matchups since. My teams are just miserable.
I think we're both in the
rebuild phase.
Yeah, we're both down there, cellar dwellers.
So as you were preparing for the fantasy playoffs, are there any situations, players, someone you're struggling with? Am I really going to start them? Am I really going to bench them? Something that that come Sunday when it's time to commit is going to give you trouble?
That is a great question. I think honestly, the first one that comes to mind, not to bring everything back to the Seahawks, but it's like Russell Wilson. Like, what do we do with Russell? What are we supposed to do with Russell Wilson and DK Metcalf? These guys are supposed to be elite. Well, Russell Wilson was never going to be an elite fantasy quarterback, probably, but DK Metcalf, second rounder or third rounder or whatever this year.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether to trust what I'm seeing with this offense. I do think that there was very encouraging signs this last week, that the offense kind of turned the corner, got their mojo back at least a little bit. Russell Wilson, I think, was downplaying the effect that his finger was having on his accuracy and things like that. But I mean, I don't really know how. Maybe it's the Chiefs would be the other one. Like, what are we doing with the Chiefs offense?
Yeah.
You know, Tyreek Hill, 4 targets in this last game. Mahomes is, I think, like the QB 17 or 18 in the last like 6 or 7 weeks. I didn't look at the exact stats.
He's been a
like,
liability. Like 5 out of the last 6 weeks, there was probably somebody on the waiver wire, 2 or 3 quarterbacks on the waiver wire that outscored it.
Yeah. So I think those are the 2 main ones that really just initially come to mind, is like, what are we doing with these wild card teams, these X factor teams? Because I could see Russell Wilson heating up, because their schedule down the stretch is really easy.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they have the Rams, but otherwise it's just a cakewalk for them.
Yeah, Houston to this week, Chicago and Detroit come up to Seattle. So if you're worried about the road home thing, those are games at home. With Mahomes, this week you've got the Raiders, and they look like the old. Well, they didn't quite look like the old Chiefs offense. They produced like the old Chiefs offense against the Raiders a few weeks ago. But then they have to go to face the Chargers, and the Chargers gave Mahomes some problems earlier this year. Brandon Staley did, back when it looked like Staley was going to make a difference for that defense. And then Pittsburgh, and, TJ Watt. I love this TJ Watt MVP stuff, by the way. And
it's kind of a fun MVP.
Well, he really is
weird stuff.
It reflects the way that there's no clear MVP, the same way there's no clear best team, the same way there's the same way I saw someone put the power rankings, Danny. They did something really brilliant. They took the power rankings and they mapped them out over a week to just show just how mercurial everything is. And it's just basically one person's perception, or an amalgamation, an average of people's perceptions.
Yeah.
And it just shows you how and maybe there's a larger thing here. We're about to go off the rails anyway. This is a larger thing about how, like, was it Kierkegaard? He said something like, we have to live life forwards, but we haven't understand it backwards, And it's like when you have to predict things when you're stuck in one point along the time-space continuum, but to really see things make sense, you would have to be freed from that limitation,
Right.
But we're riding the roller coaster of it, not understanding that when we were standing in line looking at it, that's how the roller coaster is going to go.
Yeah.
Again, vomit. But also something that, it's a childhood memory. And that's where I always come back to on the couch first. Well, actually, first, because I'm trying to do this. It's a real positive thing. Where do you live, Danny?
I live in Bellingham, Washington. So it's
okay. So you're in the area. Yeah. And I did radio in Bellingham forever.
You did?
A few years ago. Yeah. Doug and Mark Skolton. Yeah.
That's awesome.
I did. Yeah, I did radio with them for like 10 years. They were awesome guys. So tell the folks what's great about living where you live. What's great about growing up there? What's great about being there?
The thing that I grew up here, and then I lived in Seattle for a really long time, and then I moved back to where I grew up in Bellingham. I would say number one, it's just like this pace of life feels slower. Like, I lived in Seattle, the rat race was a little bit too much for me. Everybody just seems to be, it's getting on the hamster wheel and you don't get off. Now that's, just generalization. I think that life feels like it's going a little bit slower here. So that's good. It's cheaper, straight up. Like, that's important than Seattle. And honestly, just like in terms of like the surrounding areas, like, I love that it's kind of like this enclave. If you're going north on I-5, you have to go through sort of like a mountainous area to get there. So like, there's this natural barrier where it's not just like urban sprawl for like 50, 60 miles straight, where if you get south of, like Marysville here, it's like basically just this one big city that's like an hour or like 45 minutes north of Seattle, and then an hour and a half south of Seattle. It's just all one city, more or less, And so what I like about Bellingham is that there's kind of like this natural barrier. It's like, you have to go through this little mountainous range, and then you get into Bellingham. It's like on a bay. There's mountains on all 3 sides other than the bay. It's, it's like really nice area, beautiful area. I will say I'm in that point of time right now where it's really hitting me, where I start to realize why people live in California or Arizona, where I could just use a little more sun. The constant rain and cold and dark is getting to me right now. But other than that, I love everything about it.
Yeah, I love the way you describe where it is because number one, it sounds like a natural place that you would settle. Like if you were a
Yeah.
person looking for a place to set up your shop, it just among the land,
Yeah.
we're so divorced from the land now. That's a whole other thing. I'm going to go on some sort of like
I love that.
anti-capitalism rant or something. But it's a natural place to land. And then, like you said, because you have to go through that pass and it's got that natural barrier, it kind of sorts or curates who's there, right?
Right.
It's
Yeah.
one of the things I like about New Orleans is that New Orleans has a lot of stuff that's a big pain. Like the trains don't run on time here,
Mhm.
not even close. There's a lot of stuff that's just it's just kind of senseless,
Yeah.
how the infrastructure of New Orleans, there's so much about it. And there's some people that it really drives them crazy. And they're just like,
Sure.
how could you live here? Why would you, like, the potholes are just one of the emblematic things.
Sure.
But what it does is it means the people that are here are the people that really love it here, that love what there is to love about it and fully participate and give themselves over to it. And likewise, like if you have to go through that pass, etc., and you have that distance from the real world or that metro area, then that means that's where you want to be.
Yeah.
And that's nice. But seasonal affective disorder is a real thing. I went to
Yeah.
Syracuse University for 4 years, 93 to 97, and it's a real thing. And
Yeah.
it really does. It starts to affect like your outlook on life.
I usually
Your will
don't
to
have
live.
that. I don't normally have that big of a deal with it, but like lately, for whatever reason, I think it's a confluence of events, really. But like
Sure.
we just recently had, I don't know if you saw in the news, there's like what's it called? An atmospheric river come through. We had like flooding of like a 10-year flood here happened in the last like couple of weeks, multiple different times. Like it wasn't just a one big rain that created floods. It was like there was massive rain, massive flooding. Then like 3 or 4 days later, there's another massive amount of rain. So I've been spending the last like 2 weeks trying to like, get my basement to be not flooded. So I think that's kind of like affecting my overall disposition towards like where I live, because I'm just like, man, I just want to be able to like go outside and sit in the sun, but like it's not going to happen for another like 4 months or something like that. So that's fine. But I'd say that would be the only negative. I'm not harping on that. I just think that's just kind of like where we are in the winter right now, or late fall, I guess. But yeah.
Yeah, no matter where you are, there's something where the natural conditions are you're gonna have to cope
100%,
with it or adapt to it. You mentioned Arizona, that's the dry heat, no rain, and just the atmosphere. Although I love the desert. I grew up like 3 to 7 in New Mexico, so I love the high desert.
Oh, really?
I think it's gorgeous. I mean, it's just I have a real respect for the animals and plants that can live in the desert.
Sure.
Like speaking about NFL and like what works, they've found schemes that work. We have box turtles.
They're in harmony.
Yeah, exactly. Like box turtles have figured out what works and what survives through everything, the whole range of things. And you mentioned that it's a confluence of factors. One of the things I think is, again, we don't talk about it, right? Like we're just carrying on, but we're living in a pandemic. And no matter what anybody says, the social internet of how we all feed off of each other and get energy off of each other and all the events and all the ways that we associate with each other. And it's especially acute here in New Orleans, because in New Orleans, life is lived out in the streets. Like public life is life.
Yeah.
It hasn't come back, and I don't know when it's going to fully come back. I don't know. It may well be, we talk about the olden times that we can reflect on, and that goes back to childhood memories, which again is on the couch here. So I always have to ask folks this, especially when it's the first time that I get you here on the couch. Was football your first sports love, or how would sports become a love? Like, where does the story start that at some point you end up writing and talking about football to make a living?
I've had a weird journey, I think, to writing about the NFL. So when I grew up, I was actually really big into basketball. I played basketball in high school, and it was always my first love.
What was your position?
I was like a 3.
What was like the signature of your game?
Slasher, I guess. Like I would like take it to the
driving.
rack. Yeah. Or 3 points. And I was never big of like a jump shooter or like a post up guy, but I could like slash, take it to the cup. This is like the older I get, the better I was, but you know what I mean? I was like a role player on my high school team still. Sure. It was fun. And I grew up loving the Sonics. Like I was, my generation was Sean Kemp, Gary Payton, that era of the Sonics. And then, as I got a little older, the Sonics left. I kind of lost my connection to the NBA. I stopped watching the NBA. I was never super into college basketball, so I just kind of like stopped watching basketball, honestly, like slowly over time. It was like a glacial thing. But and then I started sort of replacing it with the NFL. The Seahawks started getting good in the early 2000s. Obviously, they went to the Super Bowl. That was like a big, I guess, catalyst for me wanting to get really into the NFL. And then after I graduated college, I did a couple different random jobs. I was in legal litigation world for a while there, and it was just not what I wanted to do. It was like boring. So I would ended up reading, consuming massive amounts of football content, blogs and things. And I think it was sort of the heyday of the blogs, the blog sphere or whatever. And so I ended up sort of starting my own blog on the Seahawks, and then I got picked up by SB Nation. It was sort of just like a timing thing. Because the guy who was running the Field Goals account or Field Goals blog quit at the time where I was starting to do it, and they found me, and it just kind of went there. It evolved over the years, and obviously it helped a lot that the Seahawks got really good a few years after I started taking over, and that obviously drives traffic and helps me out, and it gives me something more interesting to talk about. So I acknowledge that was helpful bit of luck. But from there, I kind of just I was doing the Seahawks stuff for SB Nation, and I expanded my sort of role there, doing social media stuff, doing NFL draft stuff, doing national NFL stuff for them on their main website. And so that's just kind of how I got going. Then got lucky enough to be found by the Ringer, and then I've been there since then.
Yeah, the Ringer's awesome. And of course, you end up at the mountaintop of the football media world, the fantasy football circle. And I love pointing that out to to young people out there. Learning what you don't want to do is still progress, right? And figuring out, having the self-examination ability to say, why isn't this agreeing with me? And then something very simple, like you said, you just found yourself. It was the same thing for me. At my job, I was managing my fantasy teams instead of doing my job. And I thought, why shouldn't I try to make this my job? And timing is everything, like you said, because I was just lucky enough to decide to try to be a professional fantasy football expert, whatever that means, before it was a thing.
Right.
Like you made your own blog. You have to have the idea before everybody else has the idea. And for people coming up now that see what we're doing and want to follow that, I mean, it's there. There's the next frontier, right? There's I want to keep bringing this up because I'm trying to put it out into the universe. My wife and I love watching these baking competitions. There's a whole fantasy layer to all these competitions, right? Because it's just a way to engage in something that you're enthusiastic and enjoy doing. We're totally that's going to be the real thing, right? The fantasy football thing is just a cocoon, and what's really going to emerge is baking competition shows, right? or whatever it is that floats your boat, right? I mean, that's like we joked before we came on the air, the fact that we get to do this as our contributions to society, it is for people coming up now, but it is that passion and that enjoyment. And I love how for you the Seahawks changed the course of your life, and may Seattle get an NBA team again. And how about the Kraken, real quick, because I got to cut it off before an hour, but Kraken, reacting to the Kraken.
I really want to become a Kraken fan. I want to get into it. I haven't been able to do it yet, to be totally
it's football season. You don't have bandwidth for that yet. It's the best nickname in a long time. It's in the running for the best nickname. It's the idea of the creature. I mean, because of the geographical connection. It's inspired. I grew up a big hockey fan watching the Penguins. So
nice.
So hockey is a great sport in its own right. It's all great. Really, there's so many things. The Grateful Dead, right? You get shown the light once in a while. You get it right. I botched that because my brain is Swiss cheese. But folks, you get it. Everything is interesting. Everything is fascinating. Everything is an enjoyable thing if you look at it or have the right context and approach. Danny Kelly, you know him. Danny B. Kelly on Twitter. The Ringer has so many great people working there. Folks, that helps enhance our enjoyment of football. You enhance our enjoyment of life by encouraging us and letting us do this. We appreciate y'all. We love serving. It's a privilege. It's a pleasure to do it. So thank you, Danny, for your time on the couch.
It's my honor. I appreciate it, man.
First time of many, I'm sure.
Yeah, I loved
it. And may our teams get out of the cellar in the new hyper inactive league run by Mike Clay. Gosh. I have a saying about Mike Clay. There's death, taxes, and Mike Clay.
Yes.
So if you've been in a league with Mike Clay, you'll know what I mean. Folks, we appreciate you so much as always. We love serving you the best. You're the best audience because you're so classy.